What's up, everyone? I wanted to talk about arrows because I see this a lot with maybe people who don't know. They go to a shop, they grab some arrows, and they think they're all good to go. But I think there's a lot more. Um, I think there's a lot more thought that needs to be put into the arrows you're selecting. So, depending on multiple factors, you know, it's important to understand the type of spine to get for your arrow. So if you look on an arrow, you'll see a number that's pretty visible. On this one, it's a 300. That means this arrow is a 300 spine. So when Easton tests these arrows, they put a weight on the center, and that weight bends the arrow down. And depending on how much flex that arrow gets, is the number that they stamp on there. So it's a little confusing, but the lower the number, the stiffer the arrow. The higher the number, the weaker the arrow. Now, why would you care about that? So, it's important to consider the amount of weight you're pulling back. It's important to consider your draw length and how long the arrow is, because when Easton does that test, the arrows are all cut at 28 inches, and when they put that weight on there and get that spine number, it's at 28 inches from carbon to carbon with nothing else on it. That's a almost, if you will, a static spine of that arrow. Now, where this comes into a little bit of confusion is when you start adding stuff to the arrow, like your field tip or your broadhead, the insert that your field tip or broadhead screws into, the vanes that you put on the back, and of course the nock to attach to the arrow. So try to think about it this way. There's a dynamic spine effect that happens when the arrow is launched out of the bow. That's different from a static spine effect because you have a force pushing on the back of the arrow, not just bending the arrow. So the more weight you have on the front of your arrow, the weaker it's going to make the dynamic spine of your arrow. So Easton has a chart on their website. It's a spine selector chart. I'll throw it up here in the video, and I'll post a picture of it on the page here so you can get a closer look and maybe see where you land. But depending on how long your arrow is and how much weight you're pulling back, that chart is gonna kind of line you up to exactly the spine of arrow that you should be shooting. Now, that keep in mind that that spine chart doesn't take into account the weight that you're putting on the front or the back. And I know these vanes are light, but you got 3 of these things on there, maybe 4. That adds up. Some people put a wrap around. That's added weight to the arrow. And of course, I see a lot of people going with the high FOC nowadays, front of center, just adding more weight to the front. I typically run a 50 grain insert and a 100 grain tip. That gives me 150 grains up front, lands me around 15% FOC. So if I look at that chart, I cut my arrows to 28 inches. Why do I do that? It's a personal thing. Um, I always cut my arrows 1 inch shorter than my draw length. So I'm a 29-inch draw length. I always cut my arrow 1 inch shorter, so that lands it right on Easton's testing mark of 28 inches. Now, it some people run their arrow all the way to the front of their rest, and some people actually run it a little bit out in front of the riser. I kind of like the arrow to sit right in the middle of the riser of the bow. Um, a lot of like old school shops might put you out a couple inches in front of the riser. It's kind of like an old school thing of your broadhead has the potential of hitting the riser and knocking the arrow off the string. Most modern bows have a large enough shelf that most broadheads that you're going to shoot have way more than enough clearance on the shelf as long as you're running, you know, straight down the center shot of the bow. If you if you take a look at that chart, figure out where you land. If the arrow chart tells you you are a 340-300 spine, this is where a lot of people get confused. So what I tell people is it's always best to run stiffer than weaker. So if you fall right in the middle of two different spines, I will tell you to run the stiffer spine over the weaker. It's just more energy is contained in the shot with a stiffer spine arrow, because when the arrow hits the target, the arrow will flex a little bit. So if you run a little bit on the weaker side, you lose a little bit of arrow efficiency when you hit the target, because it's going to flex more before it goes into your target. Where if you run the stiffer spine, it's going to maintain that energy throughout the shaft of the arrow as it goes into the target. When wondering about your front weights, I don't really go too big on the large FOC. I think I take a lot of advice from John Dudley. His philosophy is 150 grains up front is more than adequate, no matter your selection of arrow and build. So, I've just had good results with 150 grains up front. I run a hit insert, so the insert is actually inside the shaft. I don't really play around with the collars and half outs that much. I just prefer the arrow and the field tip to be smooth and straight the whole way down the shaft. I don't really like the whole bulging effect that you get with half outs and collar systems. So take a look at that chart. What are you running? Did you just take the advice of the shop? Not necessarily a bad thing depending on the shop, but like I said, I see a lot of people running weaker spines than they probably should. And I'm going to tell you, if you ever ask me, always run on the stiffer side if you can. So that's all kind of my little wrap on arrows. We do have these cool hats. Check these out. Helps us out if you want to buy one. And I appreciate seeing the merch out there. So stay tuned, man. More of this coming.